came through, and there was not. But about 1:30, I woke up and looked at my phone just to make sure, and instead it shows the whole area blanketed with snow, supposedly. And I thought, well, do I go ahead and wake up Becky and turn on the floodlights and see if that's the case? And I said, no, I'm just going back to bed. So if we did, I don't know. All I know is it's a little cooler today than it was yesterday. And we have a few days, I think, before it starts warming back up to what we were used to just a few days ago. Tonight I want to get you, if you've got your Bibles, to turn with me to John chapter 7. And in John chapter 7, I want to begin by asking a question, and it's this: how do different people react to Jesus? You know, everyone, once they learn something about Him, they have a certain response to Him, don't they? We see it in the Scriptures. And the fact that you're present here tonight indicates that you believe in Him and that you want to honor Him with your presence and with your life, or you wouldn't be in this building tonight. And yet not everyone responds in the same way. As I said, we see that in Scripture there are different responses. And tonight I want to draw your attention to verses 10 through 31 of John chapter 7. Jesus, as you may remember, is at the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles. At the beginning of chapter 7, as we noticed last week, his brothers tried to kind of push him into going to Jerusalem. And he told them at the time, he says, I'm not going up to the feast, or yet going up to the feast, as the New King James translates it, for my time is not yet fully come. But when you come down to verse 10, you find that Jesus does go up to the feast, but John tells us He does it secretly. And then, just a few verses beyond that, in verse 14, He lets us know that at the midpoint of the feast, when the feast was halfway over, Jesus goes up into the temple, and there He begins to teach. Well, in our text tonight, verses 10 through 31, John shares with us the reactions of three different groups of people to Jesus. And I want us to look at those reactions, how people respond, and then I want us to look at something that happens in the last two verses and ask ourselves, where are we at in that whole process? And next week I want to come back again and look at various people's reactions to Jesus, because it's important how we do respond to Him. But anyway, He mentions three groups of people. One, if you'll notice in verse 11 and then also in verse 15, He mentions a group called the Jews. Well, who's He speaking about? Because everyone coming up to the feast for the most part are Jews. But when John uses the term Jews, he's referring to the ruling group among the Jews themselves. He's referring to the chief priest and the Pharisees and the scribes, the Sadducees. And a lot of times, most of the priesthood came out of the group known as the Sadducees. They were the leaders of the nation. But something else that we learn about them as we read John's Gospel is that they were also Jesus' enemies. They were seeking to get rid of Him. They wanted Him out of the way. A second group that we will encounter, and you'll see them first in verse 12 and then down in verse 20, John refers to them as the crowds. I think most of our English translations refer to them that way as well. They were the pilgrims, the people who had come to Jerusalem for the feast itself. And because they've come from points beyond Jerusalem, most of them do not know about what is going on between the authorities and Jesus, the plans that the authorities have for Jesus, nor do they know a lot about the teachings of Jesus, as we'll see here in a moment. The third group that he mentions are the people of Jerusalem. We might just simply call them the Jerusalemites. They are the people from Jerusalem. So they are aware of the animosity that exists between the ruling body, between the chief priest and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and Jesus. And they know some things that the crowd, those coming in from outside, do not know. So let's look at these different groups, how they responded to Jesus, and what Jesus does in response to them. First of all, as I said, we are introduced to the Jewish leaders, or just simply called the Jews, and they have a question, because remember, Jesus has come up. He's in the temple. He's been teaching. And so the question is this, as John Gives it to us there in verse 15. How has this man become learned, having been uneducated? The religious leaders' criticism of Jesus is that he was an uneducated man. As a matter of fact, even the term in the original language for this man is a bit of condescension toward Jesus. To their knowledge, best they know, he never went to any rabbinical school to learn about the law and to be taught in the law, as Paul later will be. No, he didn't have that. And in that time, only a disciple of an accredited teacher was considered able to explain the law of Moses, to expound upon it. If you didn't have those credentials, if you couldn't say, well, I sat at the feet, as Paul did, of Gamaliel, you couldn't teach. So in their mind, what do we have? We have this Galilean carpenter, a man with no training whatsoever, who is daring to explain the law of Moses to people. How does Jesus respond to that statement? You can actually break his response, which begins in verse 16 and goes through verse 19, into 4 different parts. 2 of those parts are referring to his teaching and his motives, and then 2 parts of that refer to his hearers' receptiveness and their own keeping of the law. In verse 16, he says, "My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me." Jesus is in essence saying, he said, he doesn't claim to be self-taught. He doesn't say, well, I just sat down and read it for myself, and this is what I've taken from it, and this is what I know about it. If he had done that, the religious leaders would have dismissed him immediately. You have no authority to teach. Instead, what Jesus claims is that he's God-taught. And he will do this again and again. When we come to John chapter 12, verse 49, there with his disciples and others who are listening, he says, "I did not speak on my own initiative, but my Father himself who sent me has given me a commandment as to what to say and what to speak." So God is the one that's giving me the things to say. In John chapter 14, at the Last Supper with his disciples, there in verse 10, he says, "Do you not believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own initiative, but the Father abiding in me does his works." So God is the one who's working and bringing this about. In verse 17, here's something else he says to these Jewish leaders. He says, "If anyone is willing to do his will, he will know of the teaching, whether it is of God or whether I speak from myself." Previously, as you remember, his hearers have accused him or questioned his competence as a teacher. Now what Jesus is doing is he's questioning their competence as hearers. He's saying, if you, any man who, as he puts it, any man who truly wills to do God's will, that person will have the spiritual discernment necessary to determine where this message is really coming from. And that individual will know whether the message that I'm speaking is divine or whether it was made in Nazareth, as we might say. In verse 18, he talks again about his message. And he says, "He who speaks from himself seeks his own glory. But he who is seeking the glory of the one who sent him, he is true, and there is no unrighteousness in him." So what he's saying is, listen, if my message originates with myself, if I seek my own advancement, it's not worth listening to. But the person who is concerned with the interest of the one who sent him, that person is different. Because his desire is the glory of God. And when he has that desire, the glory of God, then he is real. He's honest. He's a person of integrity, worth listening to. This is what Jesus is saying about himself. And he says, there is no unrighteousness in him. There's nothing that is amiss where God is concerned. And then there's this last statement he makes in verse 19. Remember the 4 parts. This is the final part. Did not Moses give you the law, and yet none of you carries out the law? Why do you seek to kill me? Well, the Jews prided themselves in being the recipients of the law of God as given through Moses there at Mount Sinai. And yet Jesus points out something. He says there is a big difference between being the recipients of the law of God and keeping the law. Just because you've received it doesn't necessarily mean that you're keeping it. Moses gave them law, and yet what Jesus is saying, none of you keep it. Strong language. Now, while all of this is going on, the second group has been listening. They've been hearing this interchange, if you will, between the rulers of the Jews and Jesus. And so suddenly the crowd speaks up. The pilgrims that have come into Jerusalem for the feast. And what is their statement to Jesus? You have a demon. Who seeks to kill you? Now, as I said, they've recently come to Jerusalem for the feast. They have little knowledge of the animosity that exists between the religious leaders and Jesus. It's really the religious leaders' animosity toward Jesus. There's not any animosity that Jesus has toward them. And so they do not realize that the religious leaders, since the last time that Jesus was in Jerusalem, which is back, John records it for us back in chapter 5, they are actually looking to kill Jesus. Jesus has hit the nail on the head. They want to get rid of him. They want to kill him. If you go back to John chapter 5, there where Jesus has healed the invalid there by the pool of Bethesda, there's a statement that John records for us in verse 18. He says, for this reason, therefore, because he had done this on the Sabbath and everything else, they were seeking all the more to kill him, because he not only was breaking the Sabbath, but also calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. So they wanted to get rid of him. And in their minds, Jesus was overreaching. He had, or overreacting, maybe I should say. We might say today, you're being paranoid. You think there's someone wanting to kill you? But Jesus was not being paranoid. He really knew what was in their hearts and what their intentions were for him, something he had been telling his disciples, or would tell his disciples each time as they were working their way back to Jerusalem. So how does Jesus respond to this charge? You have a demon. Who's seeking to kill you? Jesus, if you'll notice verse 21, he points to the one miracle which he had done the last time he was in Jerusalem for that feast day that has prompted all of this attention. He says, I did one deed or one work and you all marvel. Well, what's he referring to? Well, it's John 5, the healing of the invalid there at the pool of Bethesda. On that occasion, the miracle raised the discussion about his attitude toward the Sabbath. You've healed a man on the Sabbath. You violated the Sabbath. So Jesus now goes back to that discussion from that time before, and he points out how they themselves also violate the Sabbath. Here's what he says. He says, for this reason, Moses has given you circumcision, not because it is from Moses, but from the fathers. And on the Sabbath, you circumcise a man. If a man receives circumcision on the Sabbath so that the law of Moses will not be broken, are you angry with me because I made an entire man well on the Sabbath day? What is his argument? His argument is basically this. It is the law that a child, a male child, is to be circumcised on the 8th day following his birth. That's Leviticus chapter 12, verse 3, where it just says that plainly. On the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. That's the law. That's a part of the law. Now, do the math. Would there be some times when a child, the 8th day of that child's life would fall on the Sabbath day? Yes. There would be times when a child would be born so that the 8th day, the day that child is to be circumcised according to the law, would fall on the Sabbath day. Now the Jews would do anything, and Jesus knew this and so did they. The Jews would do anything or would avoid anything that even remotely looked like work on the Sabbath day, because they didn't want to profane the Sabbath. But then when it came to carrying out the ritual requirement of circumcision on that day, they would do it on the Sabbath day. So what Jesus is in essence saying is this: you, in fulfilling one part of the law, are violating another part of the law. The law says circumcise on the 8th day. If the 8th day falls on the Sabbath, you're going to circumcise, because that wasn't given through Moses. That was given to the fathers. That goes back to Abraham. It predates the law, and it was something that was to be carried all the way through, because that identifies us as children of the covenant. So you, in keeping that, violate this. What Jesus was trying to teach them is this: this practice which overrides the Sabbath, the circumcision of the male child, provides for the ceremonial needs of a man that God has established. In the same way, it is permissible to override the Sabbath in providing healing to a man's body. If God will allow you to do that on the Sabbath, then God will also allow you to heal a man on the Sabbath. These teachers, what Jesus is saying is that you failed to understand the original purpose of the Sabbath instruction, and so you have misinterpreted its significance. And so he tells them there in verse 24, he says, stop judging superficially, or stop judging according to outward appearance. Judge according to what is right. So that's how he answers them. Then there's one final group. It's the people of Jerusalem, the Jerusalemites. And there in verse 25, they, if you remember, they are aware of the hostility that exists between the religious leaders toward Jesus. And so here's what we find in verse 25. So some of the people of Jerusalem were saying, is this not the man whom they are seeking to kill? They knew they wanted to get rid of him. And so they asked the question. Why do they ask this question? Because they're astonished at two things. They're astonished, first of all, that Jesus has the courage to defy the authorities. Look in verse 26. What do they say? Look, he is speaking publicly. And then the second part of that is that the authorities are allowing him to do it. They're saying nothing to him. So what is their conclusion that they draw? Have the authorities really concluded that he is the Christ? Maybe they really think now that this man is the Christ. That doesn't get too far, though, because you notice that immediately they come back and they say something else that we find in verse 27. No sooner have they posed the question than they dismiss it. We know where this man is from. But whenever the Christ may come, no one knows where he is from. Yeah, they knew. We know that he grew up in Nazareth. That's his hometown. He's now living in Capernaum. We know that. And he's been acting as an itinerant preacher for these last few years. We know that too. But the one that God is to send, the Messiah, the one that is to come, nobody's going to know where he comes from. They seem to take that from a passage in Malachi chapter 3, there in verse 1. There, Malachi indicates that the Messiah's appearance is going to be sudden, and they take that sudden appearance that Malachi speaks of as an indication that no one would know where he came from, rather than he's going to appear on the scene. So they say, no, we don't know where he's going to come from. How does Jesus respond to this? Well, in verses 28 and 29, he makes two statements in his response. And I'm going to just read the whole response and then I'll break it down. Here's what he says. You both know me and know where I am from. And I have not come of myself, but he who sent me is true, whom you do not know. I know him because I am from him and he sent me. So what is it that Jesus does? Two things. Number one, first thing he does is he acknowledges that it is true that they do know where he came from. Nazareth, yes, you know that. But it's also true that he came directly from God. The second thing that he brings out is this. You don't know God, but I do. You don't know him. Now, put yourself in their shoes for just one moment. If you are a Jew, if you are of the tribe of Israel or of the nation of Israel, who are you? You are one of God's chosen people. That is something that you have been taught as far back as you can remember. It's something that your parents taught you, something that your grandparents may have taught you, something that their grandparents taught them. It goes all the way back to Israel, who we also know as Jacob. So to tell God's chosen people that they do not know God, that was a bitter insult. How dare you tell us that we don't know God? And for Jesus to say that he knew God as did no one else, that he stood in a unique relationship with God that they could not begin to understand, that was more than they could accept. In their minds, Jesus is no longer just a Sabbath breaker. He's violated the big law. He's a blasphemer. And that goes back to John chapter 5, verse 18 as well. So how do they respond to him? There are two responses that John shares with us here in verses 30 and 31. And the first of those is this, has to do with his enemies. They want to arrest him. They want to get rid of him. Verse 30 says they were seeking to seize him. But notice what John adds. Yet no man laid his hand on him. How do you explain that? They were ready to arrest him and they were ready to do away with him, but no man laid his hand on him. It's just like the time when he went to his own hometown and they let him out and were going to throw him off the brow of the hill, but he walks back through them. God was at work. Because, if you'll notice, we're told why. The reason, verse 30, his hour had not yet come. The hour, remember what we talked about last week? God has designated an hour. This is that hour. And it doesn't take place until God assigns it to take place. But when God assigns it to take place, it takes place at that time. And because it was not his hour, God would not allow him to be seized or put to death until it happened according to the Father's plan. They wanted to kill him. They wanted to get rid of him right then and there. But God had said, not yet. There's another group though. It's the crowd. Many in the crowd, verse 31, believed in him. They could not believe that the Christ at his coming would do more miracles than Jesus had already been doing. And then that's their question. Will he not? He will not perform more signs than those which this man has, will he? We can't see how the Christ is going to do any more than what this man is already doing. So they believed in him. Which brings us to where we are tonight. The question for each of us is this. What will we do with Jesus? How will we react to Jesus? You see, we have the same choices put before us today, just as everyone outside these doors. Jesus is either, in our minds, a complete fraud. C.S. Lewis wrote many years ago that he is either a lunatic a liar, or he's the Son of God. You have no other choice. He's a lunatic who's out of his mind. He's badly mistaken about who he thinks he is. And he's been able to persuade others to believe that. He's a liar who has deceived millions of people down through the ages, who needs to be finally shown for what he is. Or he's exactly who he says he is and has always been. But you know, if he's a fraud, if you believe he's a fraud, you definitely don't need to be here tonight, and you need to avoid him at all cost. So what's the other option? Because there are only two. Jesus, remember last week, there is no middle ground. The other is this: everything he's ever said about himself and everything he's ever done is true. Just as he said twice in our text, he comes from the one who is true. There is no unrighteousness in him, which means that he is the Son of God. And you and I have no one else to whom we can turn for salvation. So the question for us is this: which will you choose? And as you notice by the screen up here, you have two choices. You will either believe him to be who he professes to be, or you will not believe. Your actions reveal your answer. Will you follow him tonight? Will you give your life to him in obedient faith? Will you trust him the rest of your days? Will you live for him and love him more than anything else in the world? He invites you to come, but you must be willing to turn away from a life that's been lived apart from him. You must be willing to confess him as Lord in your life, and you must be willing to be buried with him in baptism so that he can wash your sins away. And then live your life in obedient faith to him. If tonight you're ready to respond to Christ, or if you need our prayers on your behalf, we invite you to come.